welcome to Doomer Optimism. We've got Leighton, eminent journalist, frankly, here to join me. Thank you, I appreciate that. We're all very nice to each other here on Doomer Optimism and in the Doomer Optimism spheres, at least sometimes. And I wanted to bring Leighton on, first of all, because I haven't gotten to talk to him since the one time we met, I believe.
At Berkeley.
In the fire-prone foothills of Berkeley, California. And Leighton just wrote a piece for Newsweek. I believe you wrote one for your Substack as well. It was just republished in the Free Press. And it has drawn a great deal of ire. Is that fair to say?
I think from certain quarters, yes.
Yeah. And those of you who listen to this regularly will know that like fire, forestry, California ecology, native plants, things like that are kind of like my bailiwick. They're things near and dear to my heart. And so Leighton was talking about things that I would say I'd talk to, but he kind of waded into this larger conversation that has just emerged, where we have tons of people decrying systemic state level failure, tons of people looking for people to blame about the fires that are happening in Los Angeles. And I thought it would be good for us to sort of sort through how much of that is fair, what's going on in the ecology, what's going on in California. So I was wondering, this is a very localist podcast. Where are you from?
I'm from Berkeley. I grew up in Berkeley. I live in Oakland.
Yeah.
And I also lived in LA for 12 years, which I would just mention because it's relevant to this topic, obviously.
I would think so. So where in Los Angeles did you live?
I lived at first in Echo Park, and then I moved to Highland Park. Most of the time I was there, I was in Highland Park.
Okay. So I
was right near that. It's like bordering Pasadena, so it's very near the fires. Yeah.
Yeah. So I live in Mount Washington.
Okay.
And so I could see the Eaton fire ripping from that canyon on that first night. And so I went up there that first night. And I mean, I moved to this side of town. I'm to the area that Leighton's talking about because I wanted to be within a 10-minute drive of a native plant nursery that I work on that supplies plants for restoration projects on the Angeles front. So I was looking at it going, for those of you guys who don't know, it's like a sheer wall that rises above that town, Altadena, that partly burns. Right. And there are a few canyons that drain it. Eaton is one of the most famous ones because it has a really popular hiking trail.
Yeah.
It has a small population of native fish there that a lot of people don't know about. And then there's kind of parallel canyons draining that front that go along. And I can't keep them all straight, but it's Eaton. And then the next one over, I think, from there is Millard, which drains down into the Arroyo Seco, which drains into the LA. And so I saw it jumping into Millard, and I was like, I got to go. Because that was going to get in the Arroyo, and that's my place.
Right.
So I ran over there, and it's shooting, just ripping. Like, I was standing close enough to feel heat. Mm-hmm. And I have all these crazy pictures just with my phone because I was completely safe. The wind was ripping so hard. Mm-hmm. That you knew that it wasn't coming towards me at all, even though I'm like right standing next to it. Hmm. And so I was wondering if we could open with you describing your peak,
James.
What's that?
Winds can shift.
I know.
Remember that?
So for those of people who don't know, actually, I trained as a firefighter. I have a red card. Okay. And so like the part that everybody like, they do it at the end, and the part that everybody like. Sorry, I've now given a rambling introduction, but I think this will be of interest. Mm-hmm. A lot of firefighters, like those classes that they do, they're not very in depth. Mm-hmm. And the most important section of the training is the wind behavior and fire behavior section that comes at the end. And I don't want to blow up the spot of the company that quote unquote trained me, but at the end of the course, there were all these people who had no idea how drafts shift, why they shift, at what time of day they shift, all that stuff. And they would ask the teacher, they'd be like, so on 36, like it's D, right? And he'd be like, try B. And they would just fill it out. Just get certified. So it's like, yeah, it's really bad.
Well, I've been very critical on Twitter about the DEI charges, which I think are just ridiculous, but maybe what you're saying has more validity than the DEI accusation, which is just like letting people pass tests.
That's actually very funny. I didn't really make that connection until just now. But yeah, it's like it's a pay issue, because the people who are coming in at that time, it was before, I think they've done a federal pay raise for a lot of these. But that gets really confusing, because it's Fed work and blah, blah.
Right.
But if you're doing this for $15 an hour at 118 degree heat, humping a 45-pound pack, you're not getting the best of the best.
Right.
That job.
Right.
So that's an issue.
Mm-hmm.
But this is all a long way of saying, like, building up to the subject of your piece, which I think hits the single biggest basic point that a lot of people are missing. So I was wondering if you could describe that.
Sure. And by the way, I'll preface this by saying it's unclear to me how much people are missing it and how much they are not, because they claim not to be. But if they claim not to be, then I'm not sure why my piece is even of any interest at all. It seems like it should just be obvious. But the case that I make in the piece is that, I cite this book by Mike Davis from 1998 called The Ecology of Fear, which has a very prescient chapter in it called The Case for Letting Malibu Burn. So I draw heavily from that, though not exclusively. But the case that Davis makes is that LA is just these areas of LA. Malibu is the one he's focused on. Malibu is adjacent to Pacific Palisades, so it's basically the same area. That area just burns perpetually because LA is a grassland, and it's part of the ecosystem. And before it was settled, there would be these kind of prairie fires, and then they would extinguish themselves and add seeds to the soil. I think a lot of people understand this now about fire ecology, but with densely populated areas, settlements coming into it, it created a whole different situation. It's basically just adding a bunch of kindling to a fire. And so that area has burned for the last 100 years, on average twice a decade. Some of those burns have been catastrophic. In the east side over by Altadena, I think it's less fire prone than Palisades, but as you mentioned, like, I've been hiking on the Eaton Trail. Last couple of Thanksgivings we spent at my brother-in-law's house in Altadena. You like, it's just like you can feel it, right? It's just extremely dry. It just feels like a fire danger zone. People in Altadena are well aware there's fire danger zone. But I do want to separate those two neighbors out, because they're kind of two different stories somewhat. But the big story that unites them is that LA and many places in California are fire prone, in part because of the ecosystem of California and the West. But the other part of it is the rapid development of urban centers in California. California grew so rapidly in the 19th and 20th centuries that, unlike East Coast cities and Eastern cities that, had a city center, and then after that you have suburbs and exurbs and rural areas, and you have all those layers before you get to wild nature. In California, you have all these cities that directly, just like, housing developments that go directly up to national forests or to just wild or to grasslands. And in LA, anybody who's spent a significant amount of time in LA understands this. The density of residential housing development just is unbroken and uniform until it hits like the last house, and then the last house, there's a mountain behind it.
Yeah.
And there's mountain lions that are like hopping fences and eating cats. It's just city and then nature. So that's called a wildlife urban interface, and that is an extremely volatile situation for two reasons. Because wildfires that start naturally in nature can easily make the jump over into residential areas and become huge conflagrations. And conversely, sparks created by man, but by people in those residential areas, can easily ignite wildfires, and vice versa. So it's sort of like a vicious cycle. And that's the case in LA. It's been the case as long as LA has been a big city. And it's the case of a lot of places in California. It's also the same as Paradise, which was the place that got eviscerated by the Camp Fire back in 2018. It's the same with places in Sonoma County that have been subject to a lot of these fires. This is just the reality of living in California. So that's basically the case I was making.
Yeah, and it's a funny thing. Eaton Canyon, candidly, I don't know the Santa Monica Mountains that well, so we're sort of this is actually good. We might be able to pair up and know both areas pretty well or something.
Like you, I know San Gabriel better than Santa.
Okay. Well, then we can maybe focus on that. I mean, so as far as I know, I think Eaton Canyon hasn't burned for like 30 years.
Okay.
Which in classic sagebrush ecosystem, classic like Western sagebrush ecosystem, you're sort of at the outer limit of the normal fire cycle when you start to get up to 40 years. And so throughout the West, Idaho, places like that, like where they've suppressed fire for 100 years on some of these landscapes, what happens is actually you get a dense growth of essentially their basin sagebrush. Here you get the chaparral. And so the things that are really accelerating the fires traditionally in Eaton Canyon are the sages, the sagebrushes, the Artemisia tridentata, or the Artemisia californica, the more like aromatic kind of like classically SoCal sages like white sage, black sage, things like that. And those are meant to burn. They explode if certain. The reason they're so aromatic is they're sort of attracting fire. Those are volatile oils that
because that's how they spread their seeds, right?
Yeah. And so, there's a couple things in that history of growth that we brought with us. One of which is actually invasive. So up in those canyons, like you have a ton of, classic. I mean, you've seen this a million times probably in Debs Park, but all that mustard, and that black mustard that just mats up, and then without rain, you end up in a situation where actually even the kind of natural fire pace is just moving a lot faster because they're accelerants and they just burn like crazy and they dry out. And so going to your point a little bit, like it's both a product of how close we are to these fire prone landscapes, and also like a lot of what came with our presence upon them that will make them burn even faster than they might otherwise. And then, I mean, I don't know if you want to wade into this. I spend a lot of time, frankly, in circles where the word climate, you start saying that and people start going, well, that's, okay, I told you it's not climate change. It's political failure. It's blah, blah. And I don't want to speak for you. I'll speak for myself. I have seen in the time I came to Eaton Canyon, I came to a house that I assume is now burned. I haven't even gone. But I came to a house when I was 20 years old, first place I ever landed in LA. That was right what you're talking about. Far up in Altadena, right abutting the national forest.
Yeah, it's almost certainly gone.
Yeah, unless actually the fire ripped down the canyon past it. That would be the and so like I've seen this now for almost 20 years. And you just weren't getting these 118-degree days.
Yeah.
No one can say for certain whether the fact that we haven't gotten moisture now in mid-January, is 100% climate. It's not 100% climate. There's been 9 other times in the last century, I think, that we haven't gotten moisture this late.
Yeah.
So, but how much do you think, I mean, in your work, like how much do you take this into account? How much is this part of how you're looking at it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of a climate moderate, I guess you'd say. So I live in Oakland now, but lived in LA for a long time. And one of the reasons we left, there were many reasons, it was mostly family reasons. But one of the things that at least was a push factor for us in LA was just like the summers were getting worse. Like over the 12 years that I lived there, the summers are always pretty hot in LA, especially on the east side. But it just felt like every summer the heat spells would last longer and they would come more frequently. I think that climate change accelerates the natural tendencies that already exist outside of it. Like to the extent that climate change creates like heavier downpours in the winter, that obviously creates more undergrowth that's fuel for wildfires. To the extent that it creates droughts and hotter summers, that obviously makes the conditions it dries out that fuel faster and makes the conditions even more hazardous. so I think that's all. I think it's an aggravating factor. But the piece that I wrote was partly in response to like this is all Karen Bass's fault. This is all Gavin Newsom's fault. This is all DEI's fault. Part of it was that, but it was also a response to leftists who are saying this is just climate change. And there haven't been as many of those people as I would expect right now. Actually, Bernie Sanders wrote one kind of stupidly worded tweet. And then the most annoying was Pramila Jayapal, who wrote a tweet blaming it on McDonald's, basically. I mean, there was an image of
I saw
burning.
Yeah.
She was like, oh, the corporations can't even escape the situation that they've wrought. And it's like, it's this like, it's become like, I understand the reaction of people who are like, just have this knee-jerk reaction to anybody mentioning climate change, because climate change has become this, it's just like a religious faith. It's like, I mean, literally it feels like they're like, nature is angry with us. Like, it's very like the gods, we've angered the gods with our misdeeds. It kind of reminds me of like Jerry Falwell saying that hurricanes was because, men were fornicating with men or whatever in America. Like, it's like kind of, obviously it's more rational than that, but there is some element of that to it, which feels quasi-mystical. And yeah, I think that's overstated, and I think it's lazy. But that said, do I think climate change enters into the equation? Yes, absolutely, I do.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I mean, I appreciate you saying that, because that's exactly sort of where I'm at with this. And I think you can spend, as I have, sort of like years of your life, like railing against both sides of it. I remember, for example, the big year, and this was hell. And then let's talk actually about the policy failures and that sort of thing, which I think, and the conversation in general, which I think some people might not have been exposed to fully. But just to go back for a moment to me, what was really, really hellish. I'm thinking of 2018. So I was on the car fire around Reading, which was at the time hell on earth, as bad as could get. And it was, for people who don't follow this stuff obsessively, the car fire, I think, burned 300,000 acres. It was the fire that kind of like created the phenomenon in our public consciousness of the fire tornado.
Firenadoes, yeah.
Yeah, one of which jumped the Sacramento River and came into part of Reading and burned through there. And the sort of salient crazy story was the story of this grandfather who had left his great grandkids so he could try to go get help, and then the traffic jam cut him off. So he was racing. He'd cut through the lines and he was racing back to try to get him. And he was on the phone with his 5-year-old great grandson. It's just like completely tragic. And then of course, after that, we had the Camp Fire, which killed, I think, 63 people. And I think that was the year of the Woolsey Fire in Malibu, actually, which killed 5 and burned 148,000 acres.
Right. Yeah.
And people like,
I remember that, because while the campfire was happening, I remember seeing those pictures of like, those are the fire where there were like pictures of people like agricultural workers in Ventura County picking blazing mountains in the background.
Yep. And, there's a couple points with that fire. First of all, everyone seems to forget it happened. So they're like, how can a fire burn into these areas of the west side of LA? And you're like, this just happened. Like,
yeah.
And the other thing I recall really strongly from that were people on the left going, this is not normal. Climate has made this. And you're like, whoa.
Pretty normal.
Yeah, it's extremely normal. What are we talking about here, guys?
Yeah.
So, just a way of reminding people of that. But that summer, and 2020 was hell too. 2020, I was working at a nursery at the base of the Angeles Front, right at the mouth of the Arroyo Seco Canyon. And we were having these 120-degree days, and I couldn't work on the restoration stuff because it was too hot. Like, I was losing. I literally, like, I had a mental breakdown. I had to stop doing the restoration work because I was like, this is physically killing me. And so it's all a stew. But let's get into the conversation. Let's get into maybe like some of the specific, if you could outline some of the key points that people are saying is sort of like local government, state government, we are not hearing a lot of talk about national government failures, even though the fire that you and I are probably best versed to talk about started on Fed land. But so if we could get into some of this conversation.
Yeah. By the way, can you hear that? Do you want me to try and shut it off?
No, you sound fine. I'm worried I'm echoing.
There's just there's like a humidifier that's like background noise.
I think you have a good enough setup that you have some of the best audio ever in the history of this podcast. I wouldn't worry about it.
Meaning an external mic.
Exactly.
Yeah. So first of all, just to piggyback on your thing about 2020, and somebody should like write a book about 2020. I don't care if it's nonfiction or fiction. It's just such an insane year with everything that was happening with the election and BLM and the lockdowns. But I was, I live in the Bay Area and I was living there at the time. And that was during the campfire. I don't know if you remember those images of like this one day we woke up and walked outside and at like 8 a.m, it looked like 7 p.m. It was like blood red sun, and everything was like it looked like dust, and it was like, and then it just stayed that way for days. It was just this really post-apocalyptic kind of feeling where it was just like it was like the sun was blotted out by smoke. It was crazy. But anyway, yeah, to get into the issues of the blame game that's being played right now, I think some of it is legitimate. I mean, clearly, I think, well, I would start by saying this. If in any city where something like this happens, of course, you're going to be able to look back and find mistakes that were made and standards that were not met by the government, that you can say, if this had been addressed, the situation would have been better. That's inevitable. That said, some of the stuff like so they pointed to like that San Ynez reservoir having been drained. That's bad. That's obviously bad. That's obviously a big mistake. Would it have made the difference in the fire? No, but it might have saved some houses,
I stop you here because I think this is a key point. And I think this goes to big questions of California infrastructure. And if I may be candid, it goes to a conversation that I personally believe to be actively mendacious, that is being pushed by certain people to essentially argue that California doesn't build enough dams.
Mm-hmm.
And like, I think a lot of things are getting conflated there. So can we, my expertise in this field is on large landscape wildfires, mostly in more rural areas.
Mm-hmm.
So like, I personally cannot pretend to know a whole ton about what it would have meant for the pressure in hydrants in the Palisades area if that reservoir had been full.
Yeah.
But for people who kind of coming new to this, LA has a system of redundant reservoirs that provide, drinking water, usable water throughout the city, that are not empty because of a shortage of water in the Los Angeles County area. That reservoir was empty for purposes of repair,
right,
that I understand to be routine. So I guess can we talk a little bit about like what the issue with this reservoir is and why it's become such a symbol?
And I'll preface it by saying I'm no expert either in this respect. I'm just a regular news consumer, but my understanding is like there was a tear in the cover of the reservoir, and so they had removed it and they drained it and they were going to repair it, which was maybe not a bright thing to do at the height of the fire season when there were like multiple agencies warning that there might be a huge conflagration. That's just a fuck up. Like there's no way around it. The reservoir was hooked up to these, I think, like 1,000,000-gallon tanks, and I think there were like 3 of them that were then supplying the fire hydrants, I believe. And so basically they drew down all of those tanks, and then there was nothing to replenish it, which means the water ran out. It also probably meant that the water ran out sometime before the water actually ran out because there wasn't enough pressure. There wasn't enough water pressure to get the water out of the ground and out of the hoses. So I don't even know how many times the reservoir would have refilled those tanks. But my guess and my understanding, and I say those like I am guessing, I'm not an expert on this, but that it would have saved I don't know, 50 houses or something. I have no idea how many, but like a number of houses, and every one of those houses saved would have been a devastated family saved. So that's huge. But in the zoom out, like greater scheme of things, the disaster wouldn't look much different than it does now, in my opinion.
Right. I think that's right. And I think even and I'm just going off of, I have not talked to anyone at DWP. I worked for years and still am very, very close with a guy who was the head of the MWD, the Metropolitan Water District, which is responsible for supplying LA's drinking usable water. And so I have a good sense of like sort of how we get our water and where it comes from, and the larger sort of state level reservoir systems. In terms of like what DWP manages to make sure water comes to my pipes, yeah, I don't know that much.
We do know that it comes mostly from the Owens Valley, ultimately, right? So it's like, which is relevant because, and we can get into this later, but because it doesn't come from the San Joaquin River that feeds into the Bay Area's water supply, and that's relevant because there's also been all this like scapegoating around the Delta smelt and like Gavin's water policies, which have nothing to do with the water supply for putting out fires in LA.
Yeah. And so thank you. Because that's kind of the point that I'm driving towards, which is to say like the question of like how that Santa Ynez Reservoir works and how DWP manages it is actually very separate from the question of how MWD supplies water for the broader use of Southern California. And you're right that those are separate things. Gavin, I'm jumping ahead of myself now, but I mean, it's funny because Gavin has been trying to dig tunnels to bring water from the Sacramento Delta down here, which is sort of answering precisely the questions that a lot of these people on the right had about Gavin's priorities. And there's been a lot of holdups on that. But so, yeah, I mean, this is sort of the key initial point, is that essentially we do not have a shortage of water such that it is stored in dams and can be delivered to communities, farms, and cities around California. That is not what caused that reservoir to be empty.
I think, if I can jump in just for a second, I think that, like, because I imagine that some of your listeners are probably going to be people who have some stake in the water battles in California, and there is an issue with like farmers being cut off from water that because in part of the Delta smelt, although that's like the spotted owl of California, it's kind of become just a symbol more than a real thing.
As longtime listeners of this podcast will know, or readers of my work, the spotted owl is also the spotted owl of California.
No,
but go on. Sorry. Yeah.
Right. The spotted owl, I should say, is the Delta smelt of 80s in the Northwest.
Yeah.
But you know, there are real issues around farmers not getting water. I've reported on that, and I've gone in and interviewed farmers in the Central Valley who have had to foreclose and et cetera. That's a real issue, and it's one that is meaningful and has real substance to it. What I object to is not that people have a problem with the policies around the Delta smelt or around like Gavin's water policies. It's that issue is a separate one from the water that was used to put out the fires in LA. The only thing that they have in common is that they're both water, and that's been being kind of leveraged cynically as a way to create like a totally disingenuous political argument.
Yeah. And for people who mercifully are off of Twitter and don't follow this kind of thing, I tweeted early into the fires something about this, drawing that distinction, but in a kind of snarky way. And it went more viral than I was necessarily hoping for it to. And people were like, what do you mean you use water to fight fire? And I drew a lot of like hate from the right on that particular point.
I had the same experience taking on the DEI thing. That was the hill I decided to do.
Yeah. Well, so yeah, you were talking about this, and yeah, I mean, your tweet, I'm not on Twitter enough to go anywhere near as viral as you did. So let's talk about the DEI thing. And I mean, candidly, like, my entire experience with fire in California is with white dudes, like white dudes from Orange County who like motorsports in Copenhagen. Like, so I was just like, wait, what? Like, how could you even draw this conclusion? Because Cal Fire has it. For people who don't know this, though, Cal Fire has a statewide reputation as the last province of like the Californian weightlifting, like like off-roading
Right.
white man. Like that's like been the thing, like dudes with Oakleys and backwards baseball caps, and it's the good old boy network. This has been for years, the story around CAL FIRE. And of course, CAL FIRE is not the only agency involved in any of this. I mean, in some of these instances, it's not even necessarily the lead agency. But can we talk about sort of like just big picture, what people were saying, what the general charge was, and then we can get into the rightness and wrongness of it.
Yeah, it's, in my opinion, it's just so stupid. But the so LAFD, so first of all, we have to distinguish between CAL FIRE and the Los Angeles Fire Department. The Los Angeles Fire Department is engaged in battling these fires. So is half of California's fire departments at this point. But
and indeed, I mean, LA County.
Right.
We got the county and we've got the feds. So Eden Fire was a Fed-led issue. So all of this, but yes, go on. Sorry.
Yeah. So that most of LAFD firefighters are trained to put out urban fires in buildings, and CAL FIRE is the main agency responsible for, those grass fires and those wildland fires. So the DEI thing, first of all, has nothing to do with CAL FIRE. That's the state, because the accusation is basically just derived from like 2 or 3 stupid videos that were put out by the Los Angeles Fire Department. It's run by, I guess, 3 lesbians, like the chief and the assistant chiefs or something. I don't even know what their ranks are specifically. The chief is one of them, certainly. And so people are like, what? Well, there has to be a lot of DEI, because what are the chances? It's like, fine, maybe there was some diversity investment in place in raising those 3 leaders to the challenge. But first of all, I haven't seen evidence that the LA Fire Department has dropped the ball on this, which presupposes any of these criticisms is that somehow we're just assuming that the LAFD has failed in its response. I have yet to hear anybody make that case to me. But if we even grant that the LAFD did fail, then the blame is, well, it's because they had these DEI policies, which to me is blaming the firefighters, because I don't see how you can make that argument without making the argument that you had a bunch of unqualified Los Angeles Fire Department firefighters, who were obese with pink hair and were non-binary or whatever, who were fighting these fires and who shouldn't have been. And to me, I was like, this is just blaming firefighters. It seems like, absolutely. And then the other case that's made is that, well, no, because what if they spent all this money on diversity meetings instead of training? And it's like, okay, well, is there any evidence of that? I haven't seen any evidence of it.
Right.
Everybody, like, I've had this argument now hundreds of times with people on Twitter, and everybody I argue with, they come back, they're like, oh, you're looking for evidence? And they give me one of those 3 videos. Mm-hmm. One of them is a friendly interview of the LA fire chief with with some local reporter saying, oh yeah, diversity is our top priority. And then another one is like, I think their diversity person or something, or maybe it's an assistant chief who did some video for Attention, which is like a viral video production company that was boosting some TV show about Black LA firefighters or something. And she says something to the effect of, and I don't even know why she said it, and I don't even know why they put it in the video, but she says something to the effect of, oh, well, when people ask me, could I carry a man out? I'm like, well, if your man is in a fire, he was in the wrong place. I'm guessing that there was more to that, like, because it's so, like, who would say that? Like, there's probably, but I don't know what the full context was. But anyway, they point to these videos. I'm like, so what? So first of all, one thing I want to point out is that for the last 10 years, every agency, every nonprofit, and every multinational corporation has to provide lip service to DEI. Like, this is like, it would be shocking if the LA Fire Department wasn't giving friendly interviews to local reporters saying, oh yeah, diversity is our top priority. So to jump from the fact that there were like interviews praising DEI or like committing to DEI to saying, ergo, LAFD must have done all these, lowered its standards radically, brought in all these unqualified firefighters. Those unqualified fighters are fighting these fires right now, and they're doing so inadequately. And that's why the fires are out of control. Is like, there's like 5 things that need to be proved there. You would have to go out and spend months reporting that out to be able to bear out that argument. And of course, it's just a bunch of people on Twitter saying, no, look at this video. Look at this video. This is proof enough.
Yeah.
That's the extent of the argument.
And I was wondering if you felt this, like, I don't know. I mean, in so much as I have conservative tendencies or something, I don't know. I don't know if conservative is the right word, but the tendencies towards like caring about the place that I'm from and like being like, yeah, like, I'm rooting for America. I'm rooting for California. I mean, I say on this podcast many times, I'm a California supremacist. I love this place. It's not a problem. But,
Right on.
you know, there's this weird thing of like, what shouldn't, like, in your own vision of how this is happening, like, shouldn't your first response be like, I'm on the side of the people trying to help this situation and then let's figure it out? That just seems like a societal impulse that we've almost lost, which is a bigger picture question. And I mean, I'm going a little far afield here, but I think it's relevant. Like, is it the case that like people are just so disillusioned with the, I don't know, the neoliberal state, the regulatory state, this entire thing that we're sort of experiencing in late stage American neoliberalism, that we almost like have to hit a reset button before people can start rooting for it again? Is that what we're seeing here?
Well, let me ask you a question in response, and this is like a not a rhetorical question; it's a real question. I'm going down to LA tomorrow, but you're living there. My wife is from LA. She grew up in LA. She's in talking to people in LA. She's got a ton of family down there, including a brother who lost a home. And from what she's hearing from people in LA, it's like people are not being like that. Like in the city, like people are, I've heard reports that like people are like kind of like New York after 9/11 or America after 9/11, people are being especially friendly and outgoing to each other. There's a sense of LA pride that the 12 years I lived in LA, yes, people rhetorically say that they're proud, that they love LA just in the way that they do in any city. But there was never, to me, a sense, because LA is such a sort of like this sprawling city that's super localized. You just like, you're basically, if you have to leave your neighborhood, you're stuck in congestion. So you try to leave your neighborhood as little as possible. And then, but every neighborhood has their commercial district. You don't have, if you commute, you're screwed. If you work locally, like in your neighborhood or from home, then you have all the, like you don't have to leave the like 3 square mile radius that you live in, unless you're meeting somebody on the west side or something. So there's not really a sense. So we don't have a subway system like New York, where that coheres on. There is a subway system. It's just not as extensive. Doesn't cohere the city.
The last thing I heard was doesn't cohere the city.
Yeah, it doesn't cohere the city. There's not this feeling of kind of like we're all in the same boat together. And my understanding is that that is kind of how it feels right now. And that people aren't like raging against the politicians. I'm sure people have their opinions, but it's not like that's not the feeling in LA. It's not like this feeling of outrage. It's more a feeling of like chipping in together and looking out for each other, which is a rare thing in LA. That's my understanding, but I don't live there. You do.
Yeah, I would apply some nuance to that, where I think what we have seen from LA's leadership has been, I'm sympathetic to this, has been a real feeling of like them being under attack, and that some of that has filtered down. So I think some of the kind of poison and vitriol, because people in media and politics are so exposed to it and they've been feeling it, that has started to color. I get the LA Times in print every day. And that's part of my attempt to be a part of this diffuse, but nonetheless, like sort of civically, there is a civic pride in LA. I localize it largely to the institution of the Los Angeles Dodgers. And like when the Dodgers won the World Series, like there's always something there where it's like you're reminded, yeah, this is a city, and like you see that, and certainly like we went to, and don't judge me, people, but we went to Sunset Tower, and like kind of hung out, and there was a real feeling of like, like my car's really dirty. I left it to valet, and I was like, yeah, I was like up in Eaton Canyon. They're like, oh, that's so cool. Like people, and we brought our dog, and like people were feeding our dog, and like everybody was really happy to have us there. I mean, we're not even refugees really. We just wanted to get out of the smoke for a bit. I really felt what you're talking about. I feel what you're talking about in the terms of like going up to Altadena early into it. And, you know, because I'm a reporter, I can get in. I can get
Right.
California, for people who don't know, has a very, very like intense access law for reporters. And so it's at your own risk, but you can walk dead into the fire and die, and no one legally can stop you.
Mhm.
And so I was going and checking on people's houses and stuff, and I got all of these like really great sort of like well-wishing for that. And, you know, people really felt Altadena in particular is such a community and such a special place that I think I really felt some of that coming together. I also really feel like some of the firefighters feel like they're under attack. I feel like some of the civic leaders feel like they're under attack.
Yeah.
And I notice in the coverage of the LA Times, like the reporters, instead of talking about that togetherness, and I don't know, maybe this is just one signal amongst many, but you know, they're spending a lot of ink trying to just get people to be like, wait, don't be mad about that. That's not a thing
Right.
was in anyone's control. And so it does feel different. For example, on the car fire, to draw a distinction that I think is important. The car fire, as far as I know, and at least this was like the rumor, was started by a flat trailer tire, and then the rim started to rub, and this old couple didn't know. It starts to spark, and then everything goes off, right? And they made a page on Facebook in Redding up there for the family of the people who had started the fire. And they were sending hundreds upon hundreds of letters saying, this was not something you could have controlled. This was not your fault.
Mm-hmm.
And what we're seeing here is who started this?
Right.
Who is to blame? And if you know one thing about fire in California, it's that these ignitions are going to happen.
Yeah.
You can't, and they're going to be human. That I will 100% guarantee. In the winter in California, I mean, maybe you guys get thunderstorms. We don't. I have to think about that. But where we are, it is essentially impossible, absent lightning, to find a quote unquote natural ignition. So this came from something that humans did, whether it was arson, electrical issues, mechanical sparks.
Yeah.
I don't know. And in other parts of California and other times when things were less divided, I think you tend to see people really today understanding that those ignitions are probably not somebody's fault, except for the trial lawyers who try to go and sue PG&E, and then it becomes a thing. But people understand like this is just going to happen. Here, I don't sense that. Here, I sense like a real desire to find someone at fault, a real desire to blame.
Find that locally or just online?
Well, I guess my argument here is that some of the online poison is actually filtering into the local conversation.
Right. There's like this false, like, even my question is stupid. It's because everybody's online. So they're like,
that's my, yeah.
Especially LA where people are political and liberal and they're in the same. Yeah.
And so, yeah, that's exactly it. Like, again, this is a much larger conversation about where we are as a country, but you know, I sometimes feel like when people say like Twitter isn't real life, like they're actually kind of kidding themselves.
Right.
Because we have an administration that probably wouldn't even exist if it weren't for Twitter. Like, you know, like people are getting jobs off of stuff they tweeted, you know, so like, don't tell me Twitter's not real life, man, you know? And so, yeah, it's not, I definitely sense that, but what I don't see, and maybe I'm just overexposed to rural communities where people are they're much more intimate than LA NME that we all know. You don't see like big banners saying LA strong. You're not seeing that kind of demonstration of really like public support. You know, like when I was on the Rim Fire 2013, and it was like that whole town, like Sonora, Jamestown, everything, that whole 108 corridor was just capered in thank you firefighters. Like it was a love fest. And you know, maybe, and this is like, this is Twitter stuff, but you know, it really bummed me out because
it should be like on all the highway, like light boards. It should be saying, like,
yeah,
firefighters.
And I think it filters down when, for example, like In-N-Out's giving out free meals to firefighters and stuff, which is great. And then you'll have these people who start fanning this conversation like, look, In-N-Out is supporting firefighters because they've been so screwed by the shitty DEI overlords. So like they have to get the free hamburgers, otherwise no one supports them. And you're just like, what?
Right.
What is your impulse to make it negative like this? So I think it's both is the long way of putting it.
Yeah, I think my feeling as a Californian, and as it just dawning on me in this conversation, is that maybe the reason I've kind of put myself out there and taken some heat for it is because of my irritation as a Californian with like everybody's like clearly all these people left and right, but I see it mostly from the right, are trying to weaponize this in order to, sharpen knives for their pre-existing beefs around some issues that have nothing to do with this. And the thing and that's frustrating on its own merits, but if you have any connection, if you have family in LA, if you know people who've lost their homes, if for you this is real, it hits in a different way where you're like, bro, like put down the Twitter culture wars for a second. This is some real shit. People are really suffering, and it's like if after 9/11 you were like, well, NYPD couldn't get up those stairs fast enough because they had all these obese people because their DEI policies. It's like people have just like, eventually you're like, it's become part of I've reported on and it contributed to the California doom loop narrative because it's real. That really is happening here. But I know that every time like I write a story about drugs in San Francisco or crime in Oakland, the reason why there's national interest in it is because there's this kind of perverse voyeurism that a lot of people have watching the slow motion train wreck of the Bay Area and of California at large. They enjoy like those stories. I don't know if Schadenfreude or what. And so like this is just like it's just ready made, and it's like irresistible for people to just like glom this into the greater story of California shithole, totally mismanaged, run by woke idiots, and like it's just annoying. It's like that's can we at least have the standard? And I know this is way too much to ask in 2025. Like, can we at least have the standard of having a little bit of reporting done, like a little bit of actual empirical research done before you make up your theories, and then just point to the tweet that inspired that theory into as the proof of the theory. There's this circular reasoning. It's like I'm open to the idea that maybe DEI is is a problem here. But first of all, you have to demonstrate to me that the firefighters fucked up. I haven't even heard that made. Mm-hmm. And then you got to convince me that DEI is why, and other than that, you can shut your mouth. I'm not going to go and say this is arson. Well, it had to be arson because there's videos of arsonists. It's like, well, no, that requires reporting. It requires investigating. So yeah, I take umbrage to it, I think, as a Californian, because it just feels like this cheap culture war politicization of something that's very real and very tragic, and that's still happening right now.
Yeah. I mean, I not to be too earnest, and anyone can make fun of me if they want. Like, I would class myself as like a bit traumatized by this. Like Altadena is like sort of the center of my universe in a lot of ways, and like, yeah, I am taking this a little hard. Like I'm sort of like moping around the house, and Antonia keeps going like, "What are you so sad about?" And I'm like, "Do you not see like this are and so there's some of that, and just to that point, like there's this, I think, latent hatred of California. Like there's this certain like thing that has arisen where people are just rooting for it to fail, and like I find it really weird when the president-elect is just like, it's all Newsom's fault. Like what? So like, homie, what are you talking about? Yeah, and like, so let me do a couple things, and then, or let me say one thing, and then let's go into maybe some of what could end up being failures, or might be systemic failures in California that you've seen, because you're one of a circle of people, some of whom I'm friends with, who have spent a lot of time highlighting these. But as far as fire policy goes, I started writing in 2018. Well, I started writing about fire in California in 2013, but in 2018 sort of when I started my book about the state of Jefferson and about fire policy and forestry up there. And that's when I started to really like get into it in a serious way. And at that time, I was really, really down on California state government, the approach that we had. you can go back. We kind of skipped over this, but big picture here, let's just do it really quick. Big picture, California is burning at incredible rates, partly because we have massive tree die-offs. And I'm sorry, I don't care if you don't believe in climate change. Some of that is just because it's hot and dry. Some of that's bug kill from pine beetles. Some of it is hard fully to explain. Some of it is forest overgrowth. And I think we need more thinning, and I think we need more management, and I think we need more burning. And CAL FIRE back in the day was an agency directly told to me by a captain back in the day. They'd be like, the U.S. Forest Service manages fire. We put fire the fuck out. Right. Well, okay, when you put fire the fuck out all the time, then you're going to have big mega fires that you can't put the fuck out.
Right.
And that's what we're experiencing a little bit here, and that's what we've been experiencing for a long time. Newsom got that message. I witnessed him get that message. I witnessed us not burning. I witnessed burn bosses telling me they thought their job was useless and that this was an unmanageable catastrophe that was going to happen across the state. We're going to lose our forests. And I saw us get up to 770,000 acres a year burned.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't think that was going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And you want to talk about DEI. You know how that happened actually was the tribes fought for it. The tribes up on the Klamath River fought for that bill that got us to burn. Mm-hmm. So, okay, white boy, like, if you don't like that, tell me who was fighting for it. Like, if you don't want the Indians to be doing it, were you fighting for it?
Right.
I don't know. You know, I wasn't really hearing that. So there's some of that. Another thing though, we can, I think, delve into a little bit is that the impediments, which we pass laws to try to address, the impediments to burning are partly both national and state regulations that make it tough to do some of this stuff. The big offenders here being NEPA. And I just did a whole episode on this pod about NEPA. So I'm not saying it's all bad, but NEPA is a big, big, big issue for doing the kind of fire prevention, fire mitigation stuff that we need to do in this state. CEQA, California's own law, is a big issue. Air quality regs are a huge issue because you just realistically, there are all these conservatives who are saying, why does California not burn around these communities? Well, you don't burn around these communities because you get 100,000 phone calls from people saying, my kid's sick. Why are you burning?
Right.
And so can we talk, maybe not specific to fire even, about like, I don't know, is California just completely logjammed? Do we have a regulatory mess that makes governance now impossible in this state? Is paradise indeed lost, as the Free Press said?
Right. Yeah. Good question. Big question.
I know.
I mean, I would say that, like, having spent, lived a long time in LA, the level of LA's political leadership is definitely tends towards absolute mediocrity and like hackishness.
Mm-hmm.
I would say the same for San Francisco, but it's a little bit different because San Francisco, weirdly, is like the most important city in the country when it comes to producing leading Democrats. It's like, like the Kamala Harris was from San Francisco, Newsom was from San Francisco. No,
I'm sorry, I was told Kamala Harris was from working class Oakland.
Oh, right. So Berkeley is where she's from.
Yeah.
But got her start in San Francisco. All Nancy Pelosi, obviously. All these like leading the Democratic machine, sort of like its capital is two capitals are New York and San Francisco, but San Francisco kind of eclipses New York weirdly.
Yeah.
So there's high stakes in the political machine in San Francisco. That doesn't make it any smarter. It's just like the stakes are higher. But in LA, like LA for a long time didn't even produce the state leadership in California. That's changed in recent years. But when I was like growing up, it was like the Speaker of the House and the governor and stuff. They would tend to come out of Northern California, not the state's biggest city. And I've spent some time involved in LA politics, and it really is pretty dismal, I think. That said, you need to actually, like that said, first of all, like Karen Bass screwed up from a publicity standpoint by being in Ghana. I don't understand the argument that like, had she been in LA, anything would have been any different. It's like, yeah, it looked bad. It was sloppy. But it was like Gavin Newsom being at the French Laundry. It was like, that was really bad and it looked hypocritical and unforgivable. But it's not like it contributed to the pandemic. It's just like, and like, it seems like the argument being made here is that these mistakes are the reason why houses are going up in flames. Now, if somebody was making more abstract arguments that the reason why houses are going up in flames is because California has such poor political leadership, there may be something to that. But that's also a very easy charge to make because it requires essentially no evidence. Because you don't have to make a causal argument. You just say, oh, the state is broken. So I don't know. I guess the reason I'm rambling here and why I can't answer your question correctly is because I think a couple of weeks ago, I would have been like, yeah, California is screwed up and broken because that's what I've spent a lot of time reporting on, all these dysfunctionalities. And now I guess I'm just being like negatively polarized into being like liberal and defensive of California again because of all these attacks. Because I'm like, yeah, you know what? I don't think your state is so great either. It's like let's look at these the states that are doing the like. What state is particularly impeccably well run? I'll give Ron DeSantis credit. Like he handles national emergencies well. That doesn't mean Florida's a better state than California, but sure he has that. But but for every other state, it's like every state it has the same broken, dysfunctional leadership. California might be ahead of the curve on it, but we're not exceptional. I don't know. That's how I feel. I was a little bit of rambling because I don't have.
No, I thought that was great. I mean, I suppose if I was to like try to inhabit the mindset of like someone who feels like the leadership really has failed, like I think one thing that's really, really present in LA is actually a huge civic disconnect between governance and just like the people who live here. It's a heavily. But
the council person is.
Exactly. I mean, and the layers of government are so complex. There's the county. There's this, a lot of people don't even know, like Altadena is not, it's not in LA. So like, you're already the conversation about the LA City Fire Department. You're like, wait, what? And so like, even just like literally like who is responsible for policing which block? Like a lot of people won't know necessarily because you're moving in and out of municipalities and jurisdictions and things like that. I suppose I see it in a certain way as like sort of downstream of almost asset inflation. Like not to be a Marxist here, but like people don't really have a stake in this place that much anymore because you're just like there's like 5 millennials in all of California who've like bought a house that their parents didn't pay for. And so like the community level, like investment in a place and desire to be like, oh, I'm going to improve this community and stuff like that is really not there. There's so much polarization that, it's really hard for Newsom to like speak to California as a unifying leader.
Right.
And there's virtually no one in Los Angeles who could even fulfill that role because of the way that the county is set up. There is no leader of LA as a community.
Right.
And I do think that's a big failure of governance. I think it's a failure of leadership. I think probably we wouldn't be having this nonsense if, hate to say it, but if Arnold was still governor. Like, I think people felt like that was a sure pair of hands that had kind of united the state a little bit. Like in a moment, yet again, when people said California was over at the time, because the budget was busted and everything. I was young, but you remember that time. It was all of these stories in The Economist, like California's over, the dream is dead, And those of you who have any interest in this, I have an entire bookshelf of California history, and it's just book after book after book of the dream is dead, the dream is dead.
Right.
Been doing this a long time,
Right. I read a book about the gold rush and like literally like it was like, it was gold miners coming out expecting to strike it rich and then they don't. And then they're like, the dream is dead.
Yeah.
California dream, don't buy it.
Did you read the Dale L. Walker Gold Rush book or which one was it?
No, I read a book called The World Rushed In.
Yeah.
Basically, mostly based on this one guy's memoirs.
Well, and people, I mean, hate to go to this, but how many times did San Francisco burn? 5? Yeah. Like to the ground.
Right.
Like, people, there was like molten gold running through gutters, blasted blocks, and people were just scooping it up, So I don't know why I'm laughing about that, but it's just, there's this sort of, this is part of the culture that you sign up for when you come to this state. And like fire, literally our first metropolis was like every 5 years would just go to the ground, and then you'd be like, okay, cool, like let's try this thing now. And so I don't know.
This is it, since we're now nerding out a little bit about California history, which I'm super happy to do because it's very much been a focus of mine. But I've been trying to explain to myself, like trying to figure out in my own mind for a long time what the historical and structural roots are of California's particular mode of dysfunction. And for a while, I thought it was this, and I've written about this, that it was this. California is a Yankee state. It was initially settled by Yankees from New England, who are very top down and about like, big government. And so that big government liberalism comes from the Yankee tradition, the New England Yankee tradition. But then the dysfunction out, but then there's also this like left-wing libertarianism, which is unknown in Yankee culture, which is this like, you should be allowed to camp on the streets if you want to, and you like, nobody has the right to tell you that you can't do these drugs in public or whatever. Where did that come from? And initially, my theory was that it came from the Scotch-Irish. There was a big Scotch-Irish sort of migration into California, and they were very libertarian, but they tended to be like, their mode of libertarian tended to evolve more into conservative libertarian. And I thought maybe somehow got mixed up in California and became this left-wing libertarianism. I don't know. Then I read the Gold Rush book, and I read a book about continental expansion. And now I feel more like California was, I was just thinking about this today. There's this frontier, rural, underlying culture that, like, we built these big cities. It's the most urban state in the country. I think like 95% or something of the population are in urban areas in California. But like, I don't know, like, this is in LA, but it's even more in the Bay Area. This is going to sound offensive, but like some like you see a lot of like poor transient people whose teeth are missing because they smoke too much meth. But there's this wrinkled kind of like Appalachian look. That I feel like I don't see on the East Coast, even though they have the same, misrated population. And it just feels like there's this like kind of like I'm asking the best person in the world about this since you've like spent a lot of time looking at rural California, but it feels like there's this like, it still feels like there's this frontier kind of rural culture on top of which has been erected an urban culture, and they've never really cohered together.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think you could have said it better. Look, John Sutter, the man who welcomed damn near 99% of the immigrants who became the great first families in California, was a man who abandoned his family in Geneva, Bern.
Oh, right. Because he was that German entrepreneur guy, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, entrepreneur is one way of putting it. I mean, he fled debts. He fled debts there, abandoned his family, did not speak to his son until he became one of the wealthiest people like in the world briefly. Established his fort there on the American River, and then was, of course, brought down by gold because it brought in all of these people and created chaos.
Right.
And much like him, they were grifters, psychos, fake Mormons leading tribes of people and then like abandoning the faith the minute they got gold, opening whorehouses and stuff. Like, this is who we are. This is what California is. When people say it's like the drain plug of America or something, and people wander here because they have nowhere else to go until they run out of continent, to paraphrase, I think, Joan Didion, that's true.
Totally.
That is what this place is. And like every one of these great founding families, more so in the Bay, which is our first, local. This was the original, LA was the original seat of governorship when California got its independence, but it was heavily weighted towards that middle section near the Delta and in the Sacramento, in areas drained by the Sacramento River, more so than here. All of those families, with respect to Nellie Bowles and people we know, like that are great sort of early California families, like they're probably just a bunch of criminals and weirdos. Like that's
Totally.
you know, like I'm not speaking to her family in general, but I just mean that kind of thing, like up there. That's always been the case. Um, LA is a little different because this is actually kind of stuff I think people on this pod are interested in, so I'll talk about it. LA was settled by like normies a lot in a lot of cases. It was settled by people from the Midwest. Um, and you know, particularly like Ohio, Iowa, Indiana. Pasadena, people think is a Spanish name. Sounds vaguely Spanish. It's actually a place name from Indiana that was translated.
Hmm.
All the streets in Pasadena, the Gamble House is there. That's from
Right.
Cincinnati. That's where I grew up, Cincinnati. So
For people who don't know, Pasadena is like old school WASP wealth.
yes. And like for years, Los Angeles County, in the great Kerry McWilliams book, An Island on the Land, he describes these like this thing that was like a huge LA tradition of like every transplanted Midwestern state would have its big fair. And you have the Iowa fairs and the Ohio ones, and they'd fight and it's a whole thing.
Hmm.
And so just to your point about the failure of the governance and stuff like that, like there's this kind of overlayer that we attempted to do here of like state managed frontier freedom. And
Yes, exactly.
it worked kind of well for a while. The problem is like actually, I think going to the early stuff we talked about in this conversation, like when you look at California water policy, there's not a ton of democratic input in how we do that stuff. And the, you know, the State Water Project, which caused an absolutely astronomical amount of money, and was basically like a taxpayer gift to oligarchs in the Central Valley.
Hmm.
Um, you know, that that kind of behavior, that kind of managing of an incredibly complex system, incredibly complex ecological system that didn't bring a lot of public input into how these things work. The public didn't really like understand how, frankly, in my opinion, a bad of a deal the State Water Project was and remains. I think that creates a lot of downstream problems because like you can't really touch the governance and infrastructure of this place very easily as a concerned citizen. Even the water projects that we're doing now, you know, they're kind of they're backroom deals between MWD and the planters.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, I don't really have any say on that. I write about this stuff like in the LA Times. I wrote a long op-ed about this, basically decrying this lie about how fish are ruining. Well, you may disagree with me. What I view as a lie about how fish are ruining California's economy.
No, I think it's a lie. Or I think it's
Okay.
I think it's hugely overblown.
You know, and like just to do one more thing on doomer optimism, because this is sort of stuff people care about. One lie that we hear a lot about California and water is that you know, like the Central Valley feeds the world. Well, no, the world is fed by staple crops and meat. And like we destroyed the world's greatest salmon fishery, which probably like would have provided more beneficial calories and protein than the almonds and cardboard tasting tomatoes that they actually grow there now.
Mhm.
And like, so all of this stuff, my point being, it gets into like a cloud of just confusion for the average person. And like, I feel very divorced from a sense of ownership and ability to participate in the governance of this place. And as a journalist, I'm like pretty well positioned to actually participate.
Yeah.
And so if I'm feeling that way, how is somebody who just moved here from
That
Cleveland?
point,
Yeah.
like there's a very California, very surreal experience, at least from my point of view, of like I do a lot of backpacking, and if you go up the 395 to get into the mountains, I mean the Sierra High Country Eastern Face,
Mhm.
you go through the Owens Valley, where you know which is the famous like Chinatown stuff where the water was stolen from. That is a very interesting history. There were like terrorist attacks on the
Yep.
on the aqueduct at the time. It was but you know but it's like it takes about what like 5 or 6 hours or something to drive from LA to the Owens Valley. You're in like totally rural, super rural California in this kind of like desert basin with these towering mountains, and you see LADW peep trucks driving around.
Yeah.
It's the weirdest experience. It's like
Yeah.
it's almost like if you saw like a metro station, you know, like an LA metro station. But that's California, right? That's like the California is it's like frontier and empire kind of
Mhm.
dysfunctionally together.
Mhm. So yeah, I mean, that's funny because I fish the Owens a lot, so I'm like very interested in that. It's a very
So,
funny thing. Yeah, yeah. I mean, you're on LA property, a lot of
right.
the time. Um, but so maybe a hopeful thing here would be, I guess, going to what we were talking about. Uh, I think I've noticed, especially in the conversations around the Bay, failed state, that kind of thing, that you're much more in than I am, just because I don't live in the Bay.
Mhm.
One of my sort of criticisms of seeing like the sort of techie right suddenly get really, really mad about a Bay Area governance
Right.
is like, y'all didn't read the paper for the first like 15 years that you were in this area. Y'all didn't know anything about it. And then one day you woke up and you're super, super mad about what's going on. Well, you didn't care about any of this. And so you don't know anything. And then you wake up and you go, why is California so shitty? And people were forced all of a sudden to take an interest in governance.
Right.
And I sort of wonder if that won't happen. Once all this negativity and poison and stuff dies down, I sort of wonder if that won't kind of translate to a conversation about the state's ecological issues. Is
Right.
that too optimistic?
Well, I would say for the tech bros, and this might be getting us too far afield of our conversation, but I have the same beef, and I think that with these tech billionaires, and I'm thinking about like the All In podcast, for example, like these guys, who some of them I've met before, but they're like in their, I think some of their grievances are in good faith and they're honest reflections of just like watching the dysfunctionality of San Francisco and California. And then some of it is just that they started complaining about this stuff and they got a lot of attention and success out of it. And then they were like, they kind of remade themselves into populists, but they're billionaire VCs. And you're like, you're a billionaire VC populist. That's interesting. Railing about the elites in San Francisco, by whom they mean people with a cultural capital, these like sort of pinhead intellectual types or pink-haired progressive activists, as if like they're more powerful than the tech billionaires. And now, and like it became particularly annoying to me when Trump was elected, because obviously now Elon is like shadow president, and all these guys have a seat at the table. And I'm like, you're gonna, and then the H-1B visa thing came down, and I was like, and a lot of people in the MAGA people got pissed at that, and I was like, this is such a long time coming. Like, you guys are gonna LARP as populists, and then you're gonna come into this administration and be like, we're gonna take down the elite, by whom they mean their rivals within the elite, which is the credentialed class.
Yeah.
And then they're just going to smuggle their own class interests into it, and big tax cuts for billionaires, and favors for like probably dismantle antitrust regulation and like all that stuff. It's just so dismal and fake. But I think that those tech bros do believe it. Like I don't think they're being deliberately dishonest. I think that they really do. They see what's around them in California, and they're like, we can do a much better job. A lot of people are being screwed. Working people are being screwed by these failures, which is true. But to turn to these guys as like the people who are going to get out of it is just like facially preposterous. But now it feels like it's happening because now they are like running the federal government.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, maybe, I guess my theory of all of this is that actually California, just like for a lot of people during the age of the end of history, when everything was like supposed to just be like super fine, like people didn't really take that much interest in how California works, how it was governed. It just didn't really matter. People were making money hand over fist, like everything was pretty chill. And so people wake up today and go, wait, there's all this stuff wrong.
Right.
Or like there's all these problems with the state, or the blah, blah. And you're like, yeah, they've kind of been there. And maybe it's good you're noticing it. Maybe we have to come through the fire a little bit. I think California is overregulated. I don't think that's wrong. I wish I knew a way to fix it, because every time someone says, like, let's do away with CEQA, brother, what is your plan? Like, okay, what are you going to do once that's gone?
Right.
Like, I don't know how that's supposed to get fixed. And I don't think a lot of people who are saying this stuff know how that's supposed to get fixed. And this is a bigger American problem. It's not a California problem. People are like, our national forests are not managed well. They're not. I agree. Okay, what's your plan? Like,
No, there's this nihilism to the populist movement in America, which I sympathize with a lot. I've felt that way myself. And this is on both the left and the right. There's like the left-wing BLM people who are like, abolish the police. And then there's the right-wing MAGA people who are just like, burn the whole castle down. And I understand it emotionally. And I think it's actually a useful political emotion because it does galvanize people to make like real momentous change. But it has to be like, there's a point at which you're like, well, but you do eventually need to actually have a plan. Like you do eventually need institutions, and you need people leading those institutions, and you need people who can inform those people who are leading the institutions, doing sound research, making good decisions. And then you start to sound like a technocrat when you start saying this. But it's just true. Like if you just hire all the revolutionaries to run the government, you get what we've seen a million times in left-wing countries, which is like a revolutionary state regime that's there 50 years later, still talking about the revolution and still talking about traitors to the revolution, and everything's broken. It's like so like we have these political bomb throwers who I think for the last like 10 years have played a complicated but in some ways productive role. And now here we are at the dawn of the second Trump administration, and you're like, okay, are there any institution builders who are going to be brought in now? Or is it going to be those same loudmouths who are going to like literally tear everything down? And there's the possibility that things could get worse without the dysfunctional institutions that you have there. Like that's a possibility, and people will, have a harsh wake up to that when it happens. That like the institutions that they've been railing against, like the police department is like, I mean, it's taken for a way that people on the right would understand. Police departments are often dysfunctional and horribly run and corrupt and do overtime, abuse of overtime privileges and harass citizens and da-da-da-da. But, you're going to miss it if the left-wing activists actually abolish it. And the same can be said for a lot of, regulatory regimes, a lot of sort of liberal big government institutions.
Yeah. Yeah. And, well, I'll sort of wind up on my own maybe positive note. I'm not sure if it'll get to be positive, but you and I might disagree with this, but there's a certain way in which the uprising and the burning it down and all of this stuff, 2020, but even prior to 2020, California had not, and I guess still has not figured out what level of policing, imprisonment, that sort of thing is workable, just, and going to keep this state safe. But prior to all that, prior to the sort of left-wing uprising about it, California's prisons were overflowing and the state was broke because of it, and people forget that part because they weren't, like I said, they weren't reading the papers back then. So they don't even know like that there was a reason kind of like that all this kind of a little bit happened. And now we're coming around towards somewhere where you could think there's going to be a baseline agreement. Like we were probably imprisoning way too many, we were imprisoning way too many people under stuff like 3 strikes before that was completely unreasonable.
Right.
And then we overshot in certain ways where it feels like chaos, and probably somewhere in all of that, we're going to come to somewhere reasonable, I would think. Maybe.
I would hope so. I could draw a similar parallel with mental health, which is an issue that I've reported on, which is like, people are basically calling for asylums to come back, and like they're calling, including myself, for like involuntary, like long-term involuntary holds for people with really severe schizophrenia who are living on our streets. But then you're like, be careful what you wish for. Like read a book about the asylums and why they were shut down in the first place. And like, certainly nobody who was shutting down the asylums back in the 60s, was over a long period of time, starting after World War II. But during that period of time, nobody envisioned what we have now as the alternative. They did not think that it was going to be like everybody's just going to be on the streets living in tents instead of living in a backward of asylum. But then it's like, well, we should also understand like that the asylums themselves also became areas where people were just with incurable diseases were just rotting on the back ward of and a lot of people were sending their elderly parents once they had dementia to asylums to coexist with schizophrenics, and it was just super gross. And so it's like, to me, it's almost like that's the push and pull of California, is between the big institutional solutions like asylums, like prisons, the big government disciplinary institutions, and sort of the opposite, which is just let libertarianism, like just let the market sort it out, let civil society sort it out. And you're like, that sounds great on paper until you have, people having psychotic episodes across the street from elementary schools because there's no treatment plan for them, and you have criminals running rampant, and you have no facilities to put them into, and it's like, now I'm making your optimistic note look bleak.
But no, I mean, it's kind of getting to the point, like, okay, this will be my optimistic note, right? Like, okay, fine. Like, actually, we're both sitting here talking about how we've been sort of like, I don't know, what's the word, like polarized towards being a liberal again or something.
Like polarization.
Yeah, like my thing has always been in certain ways, like as just an anti-establishmentarian in general. I felt like the direction America ended up in the last 40 years was not a great one. And people who are willing to take that on squarely were the people I was going to tend to talk better with. As regards this particular instance, like, I think it would be great if liberals were forced to confront a little bit of the fact that actually, like, our approach to fire, as well-intentioned and sort of green-minded as it been, has like really not been adequate to the crisis. And also like that we have really kind of screwed a lot of rural communities out of, dependent on extractive industries like timber and other things. And the really, really obvious thing that in a long-term sense is going to save us a ton of money would be to employ a ton of people who want to be out on the land, cutting, burning, clearing, doing this stuff well in some kind of civilian conservation corps project. And if it takes a Gavin, I don't care who does it, but if we get together off of this and say like, okay, it's really, really time to start thinking that through.
Yeah.
Great. And who cares who does it?
Right. Agreed. That is
last thing, but maybe all these like psychos being so critical, they're driving us towards a point where we have to prove in the doing that like their criticisms are not valid. Okay, let's do this and show it. And in that case, go ahead and criticize.
I agree. Totally. I think we should end on that note. That is a happier note than mine.
Well, I appreciate it. Anything else to say? Anything to plug?
Plug. I don't know. I'm at Twitter. I don't even know if it's a good idea to plug Twitter.
I know. I'm done.
Makes my life worse. But that's at L Woodhouse. My Substack is leightonwoodhouse.substack.com. It's called Social Studies.
Well, you're a great, not to sound like a woo-woo Californian, but you're a great spirit. Like you're a great sort of navigator of things and a great honest person, I think. So
thank you very much.
Have you on here. And yeah, I appreciate it. Keep it up. I know you're doing Emily Jashinsky's pod because I asked her if I could go on. She was like, well, we're going to do everybody.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I did it this morning. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm looking forward to that. And looking forward to anything you do. Appreciate it.
Okay. Take care. Have a good one.
Take it easy. Bye.